Hello, I'm Assistant Professor John Wagner, and this is my video about the visual elements of design, subtopic on line. This video is accompanied as a supplementary portion for my online and face-to-face classes. In this section, we're going to be talking about the visual element of line. First off, there are many different types of lines. In these four main categories, we're going to see actual lines, implied lines, contour lines, psychological lines. I also have cross-contour lines labeled here, as that's another important function that you will be encountering later on. But within these main four types of lines, we want to examine what they are, how they're used, and how we can visually describe them when we look at a work of art. So first off, an actual line. Those are the actual lines that we see in this world. So when we see lines on a shirt, or if we look at window blinds, whether they're horizontal or vertical lines, we see them. They are there. There are implied lines, and these are broken up of various objects or even lines. They're implying this line, this actual shape, and we'll talk about shape as another visual element later on. But as we see off to the right, we can examine these three dotted groupings of lines, and we see that they are actually making up geometric shapes. They are implying what they are. So when we examine these, the implication of these lines put together, because it's connecting the dots, we can see it as a whole. Then there are contour lines, and I always say to think of an outline or the outer edge of something. A good example is saying the contours of a body when one person is describing the overall form of a person and someone suggests like an hourglass. You think about that overall shape that they make or mimic with their hands. It's implying the contour, but the whole idea put together is giving you the shape and the form. Then there are psychological lines, and these are the perceived edges of things, or when we look in an image, someone's pointing their finger, and you start to wonder, what are they pointing at? And your eye tends to follow in that direction. It's like reading a book, left to right, top to bottom, the left page to the right page, and so on. Well, in a painting, for example, we can look at those lines, and the artist is sort of tricking us, making us look exactly where they want us to look. And we can also place importance, these focal points in an image based off of these lines. So we see like pointing fingers, or where they're looking with their eyes, and you will see more examples of this. Even just like a contour of a body, we will see just pointing in a general direction makes us look at a major focal point or a major scene. So first off, let's start with some terms. A line is defined as the path of a moving point. If you imagine that you're holding in your hand right now a red marker, and you took off the cap, and I told you to make contact with that marker to a piece of paper and then lift off with that marker, you would then create this dot, just like what you see on the screen. Now, if I told you to take that marker and make contact with the paper again, but leave it there, and then move that dot or move that point, you would then be creating this line, just as the animation suggests. So moving dots or moving points can be discerned as lines here. So we see this in a whole new light, just moving dots, creating lines. Then I want to examine the term of outline, and it's defining a two-dimensional shape. We'll see more about outlines later. Contour lines. This is also getting in the boundary of an outline, but it does, like it says, it records a boundary, and it defines more specifically what that shapes represent. We can have inner contour lines, besides just those outer edges, and we'll examine cross contour lines in a little bit. I do want to point out that lines are the most important, as they are the first building block when creating a work of art. So if you're going to create a painting or a sculpture, the first thing you need to do is create a sketch so that you have a basic, simple idea of what it is you're going to create, that idea of putting it down in paper. And so that sketch is made up of all these linear lines. Now, these lines do come in different forms. They can evoke different thoughts and emotions, and that's all dependent on their use and how they're used. But as you can see up to the right, lines can be straight, curved, vertical, horizontal, diagonal, or even zigzag. And there's many more. So In these four main types of lines, we see that actual lines are connected and continuous. As you can see with example A down at the bottom, it's giving us sort of like this backward S, and we can see this line actually presented for us. Implied lines, as you can see in the box labeled B, is a discontinuous line completed by the viewer. We are connecting these dots, or these smaller little lines that are broken up. They are not all connected. But when we see them grouped together like this in proximity, we look over back at A and they look the same. It is just broken up and it's implying that line. Think of ducks in a row. We see these ducks following their mother, and then it's implying this line, this row. Then we see contour lines. It's created by the edge of things, and it can help illustrate the roundness. We can also tie that into box C. So when we see the outer edge of these lines, we can see the contour edges of it, but these are all separate lines. When we look at the box C, this psychological line, it is actually not these horizontal lines. It is the edges. It's this invisible line. See where that backwards S is located. We are just looking at that outermost edge, and we start to see it psychologically as a line, but there's no line there. There's no line being connected. So in looking at this example, I want to ask you, what lines do we see here? Are they implied? Are they psychological? Are they actual? Or are they contour? Now, we could see the actual lines in the fabric on the ground, but then we start to examine these knees. And I'm going to show you a quick little animation here. If you follow them, we can see that contour line of both the knees on these legs. So it's just the simple contour line, and notice that direction in which it moves us. Speaking more about contour lines, we want to discuss cross contours. These are the lines that move across a shape or an object to illustrate its depth. I always suggest topographical maps as an example. So when we look at the seashell off to the right, we can see the major contour line or outline being presented, but on the inside, these contours, the inner contours, give us an example of the peaks and valleys, the depth within this object. So it's not just a flat object anymore. We can give it depth through these lines. It can have very expressive qualities, though, depending on if it's a smooth line or a jagged line. The overall effects, they can be numerous and mean different things. Some people have a tongue-in-cheek humor. If you see the image on the left, the fox sculpted out of wire, we start to examine it, and we can see the overall cross contours and the illusionistic effect of the lines. But we start to examine the wire and wonder, what is it made of? And it's chicken wire. Now, as the two related to one another, foxes and chickens, we always think about keeping the foxes out of the hen house, and in order to do that, we have to use the chicken wire. So the fox is actually being contained, in this manner. Now, when we talk about the other characteristics of line, we want to talk about its length, its width, how thick and thin, how long or short the piece may be. And this can also give us something called atmospheric perspective, and also linear perspective as well. The overall larger, wider lines make them seem closer to us. The smaller, thinner lines can seem far, far away. But when we're seeing these two lines, these blue lines in front of us, which one seems more dominant? And those can lead us to focal points. Then we look at other expressive qualities of a line. They can be delicate, elegant, assertive, forceful, or even aggressive. And that's where I've given you two lines down at the bottom and what they present. So when you look at the image on the far left, it's giving us this rhythm of this heartbeat that seems normal and healthy. But then if we look to the right, where we see this beat and then it stops and it flatlines, it actually becomes a flat line. When we see flat lines like this, if you think of a lake and how it has these ripples and it creates motion, it can seem aggressive depending on what's in the water. But then if it's calm, it's just a flat line. And that's what we see, a calm line here in this cardiogram. But it's calm, it's dead calm, right? So we think about the presentation and the characters or expressive qualities in these types of lines. So when we talk about direction and movement, they can imply different things. So vertical lines, they are assertive. They show us growth and strength. Horizontal lines, they make things appear calm and stable. And diagonal lines, they're very dramatic. They can show us direction, movement, or where they're coming from. So take a look at this animation. We start to see these people moving based off of these lines. Starting on the far left, this person running down a hill, or maybe falling down. On the right of that, person running to the right in these action lines. It's like a kid drawing a car. It's very simple. These lines suggest movement. The third person then suggesting that they are flying or jumping. And the last person falling down, or maybe even crazy hair, right? But these lines suggest things all the time. So now this is the pop quiz. I want you to picture in your mind a line, any type of line. What does that line look like? Did your line look like this? Think about it. You may not have even thought about a line like this. But when we think about lines, is this still considered a line in this concept? We're seeing the lines move everywhere. Notice that the bigger, thicker lines seem closer to us. And then farther off into the distance, the smaller little lines appear. Now, looking at Pollock's piece, we'll examine this in another video later on, but he's using this paint and splattering it all over the canvas and sort of dancing with it in this linear fashion, swirling it around, making it seem somewhat delicate, but then somewhat aggressive in some little areas. And then you can start to focus in on, particular groupings, and you start to see things. But that'll be another video as well. But it's just using line. Another example, the St. Louis Arch. One suggestive line and what it all means. You'll see this in a later chapter. But it's just one dominant line that we do see in our world today and used as a site-specific artwork. In this painting, this is where I was talking about the contour lines of all the bodies and going in a general direction. So if we think about all of the lines here that are present, the actual lines within the cloth and the lines of the rope and the lumber, even the contours of the clouds and the waves. We even see a horizon line in the background and how it seems to be calm, sort of in the middle where the sunlight is coming from. But on the far left, the waves, they're just very agitated. And we see these people on this raft of the Medusa. Some are dead and clinging on to dear life and hoping, for help. And they're actually looking off into the sunset on the horizon line where there's a tiny little ship and they're screaming out for help. But I want you to notice the psychological lines where the hands and the faces, where they're all looking and pointing towards. The majority of them are up here. We kind of see this triangle brought in by these contours, leading us all in. Even the bodies, the contour lines, the directions, making us look. It's making us sort of read the page. We want to focus in on here as they're crying out for help, trying to get someone to capture them on this raft as castaways. So here are some examples of those lines and where they are and that movement within. Here's another artwork. This is by Robert Smithson, his spiral jetty. This large land line, so to speak, is made entirely of earth. So this earthwork, he's on the Salt Lake City. He has created the actual spiral going through. And it ends right here. And what does this line represent? Well, we'll get to examine that later on. But when we look at this line, we want to examine it as straight and then curving and becoming this spiral and this inward reflection and what it could all mean. But he's just using this line, this huge, massive line that you can actually go visit in the Great Salt Lake. We can see that this whole idea being presented and using line and using these organic shapes, using the earth. Another example here, and also a favorite, this is dynamism, showing us all the dynamic movement in the painting. So this is dynamism of a dog on a leash. So this style of artwork is showing us movement in this painting, and we start to wonder what is moving, and the answer is everything. The dog leash, the dog, the tail, the legs, his ears, the dog walker holding the leash. We see the lines from the leash even going back and forth. And almost like jump rope, but the legs, they're moving as well. And you probably didn't notice it, but there are these lines in the background, and that's suggesting, again, like those stick figures, the ground is moving because we're seeing them walk so that we appear to be moving. It's like driving and looking down at the ground, and you can see these lines, blurred lines everywhere. And that's just showing you an example. Here's one other example here of The Calling of St. Matthew by Caravaggio. When we take a look at the raking light, the light source coming from the right, we see the shadow creating this stark line, this actual line beaming down and focusing on this figure that's pointing at himself. This is the future saint, Matthew. He is being called out by Jesus for taxing these people on their religious views, and these tax collectors counting up their money. We see these psychological lines looking at the money, not even paying attention to Jesus Christ in the background with his halo. And we start to see other actual lines like the sword pointing in this general direction, and the psychological line and the contours of his hand. You know, Jesus is calling him out, and Matthew is saying, who, me? He knows he's in trouble. And we start to see people looking in other directions and how everything is focused and where we look and where all it's concentrated. And lines are very important. And that's what we need to consider, especially if you're an artist. How do you use those lines? Thick, thin. How do you use those psychological lines? The placement, the positioning. It's all about that position in your composition. Now, another discussion about lines in art. This is optical art. Based on proximity, we can see that the lines that are closer together, they seem to be squeezed in with one another, and it creates this ripple effect on this canvas. And farther apart, again, they are wider and spread out. If this is bothering you, just look it away. But this optical sensation of these lines of repetition, they're using the repetition of color, the overall shapes of these lines and how they're slowly curving and getting closer in peak areas, and it creates this optical effect. So again, lines are very important in the way that you use it. This wouldn't have been accomplished if they wouldn't have used it in that manner. So to recap, there are these 4 types of lines that you always want to consider when analyzing your visual artwork. So you always want to cross off your list if you've talked about actual lines, implied lines, contour lines, if they're cross contours or just your basic concept of contours, psychological lines, and then talk about where these pieces are visually, you know, from the left to bottom left, you know, tell me exactly where they are. And notice where these lines are coming from, what they're leading you towards, and is it telling us something? You know, focusing on one particular area more than the other. Now, with all these views of line in mind, once you do this in your visual analysis, you may have a better understanding as a whole. Good luck!